I think what I took away from this wonderful day, and I really thank everybody who came, all of these brilliant presentations, all of you who stayed and asked wonderful questions, is that we have an economy that is collapsing. We have a political structure that is intransigent. We have a culture that is in disarray and in rebellion. We have a pseudo-totalitarian regime that has lost its monopoly on media. We have an elite that can't make decisions. But some of the elite is keen on war. We have an elite in the United States that might be keen on creating a war for its own domestic purposes. And if that's not enough, Russia is on march in Iran, and China might be turning Iran into a satellite state. If that doesn't make for a depressing Friday afternoon, but if anybody can bring optimism to this scenario, it is these three wonderful collaborators for this event. So why don't we begin with Larry and then go down and have your take on what you have heard today.
Okay, well, you know, the really big elephant in the room for me is the parlous state of the economy and the I'm going to use your word, bankruptcy of the financial system. You know, what I get out of this is, you know, the big, I think, both long-term, as Puya was suggesting with the trends, and shorter-term, you know, contradictions, to use a Marxian word, that I think make the Islamic Republic of Iran in anything like its current form unsustainable. You know, we do not, Mike is always kind of elevating our ignorance about transitions, and we certainly do not have predictive ability in terms of being able to predict when and how a transition will happen. We don't have very good predictive ability in terms of being able to predict what the transition will be to. But I think we're not without a certain amount of predictive ability about the fact, about the inevitability or likelihood of a transition from something. And this conference today has certainly solidified and in some ways clarified my strong analytic hunch that the transition from something is, the conditions for it are ripening. Now, I just want to make you know, 2 or 3 more comments. One is, if anyone in this room thinks that it can get so bad that a transition to democracy will be almost inevitable, I just want to say one word to you: Venezuela. Venezuela, and it's a comparison that's worth a little bit of thought, not least because it's another oil economy, not least because China is in some ways bailing it out now with long-term oil purchases that are leading the Maduro government to mortgage that country's sovereignty, not least because the regime has devolved in very, very dramatic ways from what it was. You know, had some kind of ideological flavor. It was very perverted and increasingly anti-market, and of course it was deeply authoritarian. But now it's just becoming more nakedly repressive with much greater reliance on the security apparatus, even more kind of vulgar and personalistic authoritarianism, and kind of a willingness to shed all of the facades just to hang on. And, you know, one can always get carried away by comparisons, but I think this kind of perversion is possible to some degree in Iran, and backed up against the wall, it is certainly possible to imagine. not so much an outright military dictatorship, an IRGC dictatorship. I mean, what's their mileage in completely abandoning the Islamist aspects of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but an ever more authoritarian regime, ever more repressive, where the military and security component of the authoritarian triad of domination becomes more and more elevated. And so if we understand that nothing is inevitable, that just because the conditions are ripening doesn't mean you're going to get a transition to democracy, we come back to where we started. And the thing that I think is most worrisome to me is not just what Ali was saying, I don't see him here now, that civil society has really been decimated, and that certainly takes away one pillar of optimism or one source of potential optimism for peaceful and democratic change. But I don't see anywhere, serious strategizing on democratic transition. And we know from previous experiences of democratic transition the kind of strategizing that is needed. We know enough about democratic transitions to know that there are two things that absolutely must happen, particularly in a situation where there are so many obstacles that remain, not just to regime collapse, but to regime collapse that is succeeded by something resembling democracy. Number one, you've got to split the regime, and number two, you got to unite the opposition. And then the question emerges of who are the actors that become relevant there, who has the standing to do the unification, what are the specific elements of strategic thinking that are associated with that. There's lots of experiences that could be consulted here. There's a whole body of strategic resources sitting at a particular think tank in Washington, which the regime is hyper allergic to and hypersensitive to, because they think that place is particularly a repository of thinking and strategizing about regime change. But I just don't see any of this going on. And if we are going to witness at some point an unraveling of the financial system into, at a minimum, deeper economic disarray, financial panic, many people losing their savings as a result of these financial Ponzi schemes, their retirement, much more intense hyperinflation, I would think, would be one consequence of this. How can this be utilized in a way, how can this be engaged in a way that would move the system in a better direction? And if Democrats or people who aspire to see Iran evolve into a more decent and pluralistic political system don't have a strategy for dialoguing with elements of the regime to pull them away from, solidarity with the regime, I don't think there's going to be a good outcome. And I'll just, aside from the obvious points that could be made about some of the more flexible elites in the system and alliances that could follow from that, one thing that I have kind of gleaned from Saeed's writing about the Basij, and it's too bad we didn't have time for you to dilate on this, is, we should not assume that these kind of proletarian shock troops of the Islamic Republic are all, happily unified behind the regime. And a lot of this kind of working class base, security base of the regime must be feeling its own sense of betrayal and questioning and so on. But can the cosmopolitan secular elites who generally are the ones who come out onto the streets and protest the Islamic qualities of the Islamic Republic, is there any means or modalities for them to, have dialogue with and find common ground with some of the potentially alienated base of the regime. These are the kinds of questions people could be asking. I will say I think there's a parallel in the United States, which Frank and others have been writing about, where the so-called knowledge elite in the United States could actually make some progress in terms of recovering democracy in the United States by reaching out to, working class elements that have defected from the Democratic Party in the United States, but that's not the subject of this conference. In any case, I don't see that strategy happening. I don't know who would be the leaders and organizers and thinkers of it. I don't know to what extent the diaspora has made any progress at all in transcending its own depressing and paralyzing divisions of the last, 30, 40 years now. But, the crisis could be coming fairly soon if you take seriously what has been said over the course of this day. And so I'll just close by saying now I think is the time for really serious analytic and political strategizing about how to respond to this and move and nudge the situation forward in a democratic direction.
So in 1968, Samuel Huntington wrote his classic book, Political Order in Changing Societies, and he put forward this basic model for political decay in which the rate of social mobilization in a modernizing society outruns the development of political institutions, and the new groups that emerge are not represented by those institutions, and that does not lead to a smooth path of modernization. It leads to collapse, civil wars, coups, various forms of instability. So in listening to a lot of the presentations, of course I was, struck by the economic and ecological demographic crisis that Iran is facing, but I was actually most struck by the social mobilization that's been happening in that country, which you see in terms of numbers of women educated, urbanization, people moving. I mean, in fact, it's a very difficult situation because it's what's sometimes called modernization without development. That is to say, you have a lot of the social trappings of modernization, but without robust economic growth that would keep people employed and happy and so forth. And so it seems to me the situation there is a kind of classic one that Huntington was talking about, which would mean instability down the road. And so none of us can predict what form that is going to take. But that seems to me a useful frame in which to think about things. Now, the second point is about the international situation. That's not just happening in Iran, that's also happening in Saudi Arabia and in other parts of the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia is also educating a lot of women, and you're getting a new middle class and so forth. And so I sort of think, so you've now got this spreading Sunni Shiite civil war within the world of Islam, fostered by Saudi Arabia and Iran on the two sides, which is now spreading, in Yemen and Lebanon and all throughout the region. But the two big sponsors of this civil war are both themselves pretty sick. And I sort of think that the big, external wild card is this kind of competitive political decay, which of them is going to collapse first. I think that between the two of them, the United States has completely bet on the wrong horse. To bet on Saudi Arabia, I think, is just lunacy because, if you had to ask which of these two societies would be able to come out the other side as a more coherent political entity, by far it's Iran. I mean, Iran is a real country. I don't know what Saudi Arabia is, but it's not, it's a tribal federation sitting on a lot of oil that has the trappings of, a modern state, but it really is not a modern state. And if that regime collapses, then you have no idea what's going to come crawling out of, the remains of it. Whereas, Iran has an identity apart from this Islamic regime that's been there since 1979. In fact, it's got one of the oldest national identities of any society anywhere in the world. And so there's a real basis for state continuity and, stability and picking up the pieces if this, this kind of transition happens. Just a couple of pet hobby horses of mine. I mean, somehow a lot of Americans have convinced themselves that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, which I think is just a pile of BS. What Iran does is it supports other, like-minded Shiite groups, just like any other, power does in international relations. And it's really Saudi Arabia that's been, by far the biggest sponsor of terrorism through all of its funding of madrasas and, this incredibly reactionary Islamic ideology. And it's interesting, so I was talking to Syed earlier. He's just written this book about how the Iranians tried to do this kind of religious education, and as I understand it, you're saying they failed completely, which is good. Unfortunately, the Saudis have really been succeeding, and I think they're the ones that are responsible for the spread of all this ideology in Southeast Asia now, and so anyhow, that's kind of not relevant to our discussion. So I think that's the kind of frame that I see coming out of this, is that you have a region where there's going to be political decay, and there's political competition among these decaying states, and we'll just wait to see what, which one happens first.
I'll just be very brief. It's late in the day, so we should wrap up. My biggest takeaway from this meeting is the wealth of empirical data, analytic robustness that we had throughout the course of the day. So we were kind of your sidekicks, Abbas, but Abbas, we thank you for mobilizing your community here and your network to get the best and the brightest from around the world, and that's what it felt like to me today. But it also felt, number two, we don't know the moment of transition and revolutions. I remember sitting in the White House Situation Room in 2009, across the table with some people whose whole job it is. They work for, I shouldn't talk about who they work for. You can guess. And this question of, well, why didn't you know this was going to happen? Well, why didn't you know it? You academics, why didn't you say it? Well, why didn't you guys know it? And we're kind of back and forth about, well, who did not predict the green movement? And when we repeated that again, by the way, in 2011, in the same room with different people, but same debate. So that is not very interesting, right? Revolutions seem impossible beforehand, and they seem inevitable after they happen. We're not going to predict that. But what we can do, I think, and what I would say is our imperative to do, given the talent that have been mobilized here, and I would say more broadly, Iranian studies at Stanford and now in partnership with CDDR and FSI, is we should be more devoted to the diagnostics and where data really matters, and when we talk about numbers and not just a kind of what often happens in Washington, a kind of abstract debate about regime change and references to Iran with related to whatever is your favorite historic metaphor, right? That happens. We don't need to be a part of that. And I guess my challenge to everybody here, but Abbas, you in particular, is let's dedicate ourselves to informing Americans and the world, aggregating the data that we've seen here and the analysis, and being more in it, because frankly, there's not a lot to read on Iran. I tried to prepare for this event, and I have a pretty good network of friends and research assistants, and it's the paucity of serious academic work on Iran is still we need to fill it. That's my challenge to us, right? And we have the people in the room here, and let's take that on and think about the right different modalities. It need not just be an edited volume, although that may be one, but to really put our oar in and to say, we don't know when that change is going to happen, but on the diagnostics, I heard some things today that were new and interesting, and we would do, America would be well served and the world would be well served if we tried to get that information out into a broader debate.
Well, then let's end with two happy notes. First, we're going to finish 10 minutes earlier than we said. That's happy news. Second, is that I think the richness that you saw here and the richness that is in Iranian diaspora, one of the most remarkable diasporas, I think, anywhere, and their accomplishments, not just in the world of business, in the world of technology, in every domain, and it is a diaspora in the sense that they are committed to bringing about change in Iran, is to me the most optimistic aspect of the possibility of achieving a more peaceful, a less violent, a less drastic transition. I think the Iranian diaspora can do for the transition to democracy and to a better Iran what Jewish diaspora did for Israel, what Indian diaspora did for India, what Chinese diaspora did for China. And what you saw here today is a small, truly, the tip of the iceberg of what this diaspora is capable of. All we need to do is mobilize it.